This story is called The Baker's Dozen. Once upon a time in Albany, New York, before it was known as Albany, New York, there was a baker known as Van Amsterdam. Now, he had the best, most prosperous bakery in the city, and he was known for his little New Year's cakes and his gingerbread babies, which were adorable and moist and looked just like his own children. Well, this one winter was particularly harsh. The snow was high, people were not in the mood for sharing and waiting in line, and Van Amsterdam was under a lot of stress. He was baking all day, shoveling snow every morning, gathering extra wood for the fires because it was so cold. He hardly had time for his own family. He hadn't seen his own children in days and days, and he was starting to get grumpy. He would come home from work, eat a quick meal, go to sleep, wake up in the middle of the night to come back and start shoveling snow and gathering wood and baking more cookies. So when the end of the season came, and it was December 31st, and he was just about to close up shop for January 1st, the one holiday he observed, he was ready. By the time the end of the day rolled around, he was so ready to close up shop. He turned off his ovens, he put away his cookies, he was just about to lock the door when he heard the knocking. Oh. Well, it's closing time. I'm closed. I'm not opening the door. He turned to leave, but it happened again. Go away, we're closed. He waited. He didn't hear anything, so he thought, oh, whew, dodged the bullet there. Turned to go. But one more time. Oh, we're closed. It's time to go home. He went and opened the door and saw this tiny, frail, withered old woman heavily leaning on a cane wearing rags, who had to squint to see him. I need a dozen cookies. Ma'am, we're closed. It's late. It's time to go home. I don't have any more cookies. I'm sorry. Come back the day after tomorrow. I'll give you some cookies. I need a dozen cookies. Ma'am, we're closed. You're going to have to go. I'm sorry, but it's time to go. I said I need a dozen cookies. I heard you. I'm not deaf. Fine. Come in. I'll get you some cookies. So begrudgingly, Van Amsterdam opens the door, relights all the lights, and picks out quickly 12 of his best cookies, wraps them up, hands them to the old woman. There's your cookies. Now, have a nice night. This is only 12. I need a dozen. Yes, a dozen is 12. Here you go. Have a good night. I said a dozen, not 12, a dozen. Yes, 12. 12 is a dozen. A dozen is 12. They're the same thing. I've given you a dozen. I've given you 12 cookies, wrapped them up in a nice little package. Now we go home and eat them. Listen, I said a dozen cookies. A dozen is 13. A dozen is 12. A dozen has always been 12. 12 is a dozen. A dozen is 12. 13 has never entered the picture. Where are you getting 13? I said I want 13 cookies. A dozen. Lady, I've given you your dozen cookies. It's time to go. If you want a 13th cookie, go get it from the devil himself. And with that, Van Amsterdam scooted her out the door, closed it, locked it, and turned to leave. Well, it was then that things started going bad. All of a sudden, Van Amsterdam felt like he was being beat up. There was nobody in the room with him. He was by himself. But he knew at that moment that that woman was a witch and had cursed him for his stinginess. And he was getting beat up, and his pies were flying off the shelves, and cookies were coming at him. Bread was flying at him like missiles. His giant, beautiful wedding cake slid off the table and splattered all over the floor. Oh, what am I going to do? This needs to stop. Oh, St. Nicholas, please come and help me. Van Amsterdam was answered by a voice, a booming voice, which he assumed to be St. Nicholas. Maybe you should have been a little nicer to the old woman. Maybe you should be more caring and spread your generosity to those who are less fortunate. Yes, yes, anything, I'll do anything you say, St. Nicholas, just please make it stop. So, Van Amsterdam, fully prepared to run down the street chasing after this old woman, threw open the door, saw her standing right there, and shoved a plate of cookies at her. Take whatever you want, take as many cookies as you want, just please make it stop. And with a snap of her fingers, everything was back to normal. The pies were back on their shelves, the beautiful wedding cake was unsmashed and returned to the counter where it sat. I hope you've learned some generosity, said the old woman. She turned to go and vanished, just like that. From then on, Van Amsterdam always gave 13 cookies in a dozen. And that is how the baker's dozen was started.